So I have a new favorite Fuji lens. It's this big zoom lens, and I never thought I'd say that because I'm a believer in prime lenses. I like their efficiency, their economy of size, their singleness of purpose, and just how sharp they are. They're small, you can carry a lot of them at one time, they fit nicely on the X-T30. Prime lenses are my favorite. So on the other hand, I've never really been a big fan of zoom lenses, especially the 18 to 55 kit lens, which changes aperture as you zoom through the zoom range. That to me has always felt a little bit messy. I never really liked that. But recently on a trip to northern Michigan, I brought my X-T4 and I brought the 16 to 80 zoom lens. And I quickly started to make mental notes of what I liked and what I didn't like about it. What's kind of interesting is I can't really say I didn't like anything about it other than its size. It's pretty big. It's bigger than the prime lenses I'm used to using. So that's one strike against it. However, my list of pros for this lens just kept growing. It's so good I think it can actually replace some of that reliance on prime lenses. So I'm going to give you 6 reasons why I think anybody with an X-T3 or an X-T4 should own this lens. Number 1, the zoom range. It's massive. 16 millimeters on the wide end, 80 millimeters on the telephoto end. That's a huge range. It gives you massive opportunities for differences in depth of field, differences in angle of view, and differences in compression. One interesting use that I've found for this lens is actually drafting photos. What I mean is I'll take practice shots with the 16 to 80 at different focal lengths in order to get a sense for what I want to do in terms of depth of field and compression. And in that case, usually what I do is set the aperture to f4. I set the ISO to auto to let it go as high as it wants. And then I figure out my composition. And then once those things are resolved, then I might switch over to one of my prime lenses, which has a dedicated focal length and wider aperture. That way I can turn the ISO back down. Here's an example. My father-in-law wrote these books, or contributed to these books. It's a big collection of books. I was going to include an image on the website that I was making for him, but I wasn't sure how to photograph it. I ended up settling on a classic one-point perspective, but even though this is just a set of books, there's a variety of different ways that you could approach it. So I ended up taking a series of shots with this lens and ended up sort of arriving at 50 millimeters as the desired focal length. So after drafting that photo, I then switched over to the 50mm f2.0, which has a bigger aperture, sharper at that particular focal length, and took the final shot that way. But this wide zoom range let me work through all those different focal lengths very quickly and let me settle on a final composition. Pretty cool use for this lens. Number 2, the constant aperture. It's very nice to always know reliably that your aperture can stay set to 4.0. It's not the widest aperture, obviously, but that's part of the concession of the massive zoom range. Most zoom lenses cycle through a range of apertures. As I mentioned, the 18 to 55 zoom lens ends up going all over the place in terms of aperture value throughout the zoom range. This stays in one place, which means that you can use the same manual settings all the way through the zoom range and always get the same results. I found that to be very nice, ended up making for a much more pleasant shooting experience because I knew exactly what I was going to get. With variable apertures, it kind of feels like a guessing game. Number 3, the stabilization of this lens is just, it's out of control. When you pair it with the X-T4, which already has amazing in-body stabilization, the combination of those two things is just incredible how stable it is. You can end up taking video that ends up looking like it's sitting on a tripod. And the stabilization means that you can take handheld photos in low light with amazingly long So that incredible stabilization, so that amazing shutter speed, so that amazing stabilization combined with the X-T4 means that you can get shutter speeds that are insanely slow, just staggeringly slow, and the resulting images are still crisp and clear. You can't sense any motion blur at all. It completely annihilates that whole rule of thumb about a 60th of a second is the lowest you want to go. With this, it just completely changes that. You can easily go down to a 15th of a second, an 1/8 of a second. I was getting exposures this past week of a full second in handheld photos, which is just mind-blowing. So what that means is you can reliably set the shutter to auto and just let it do its thing, even in low light. It's pretty amazing. So number 4, fit. I'm talking about form here. So even though I mentioned that this lens is pretty big, it's big for something like the X-T30 or the X-T3 or X-T4. But for the X-T4, it actually feels like it was made for that camera body. On the X-T30, it feels very nose heavy. It's not really made for the X-T30 or cameras of that size. It's made for the X-T4. When you mount it to the front of the X-T4 or the X-T3, it feels very balanced. It feels very good in the hand. It matches the design language. You look at the two of them together, they look like they were built to be together. One more thing on the topic of form. This thing has a 72mm filter size, which is a very common filter size. That means you might have filters already in this size that can fit onto this lens. It also pairs up nicely with the 10-24 if you want to pair it together with another zoom. So then you can have filters that work for both of those zoom lenses. Pretty nice to be able to move filters from one lens to another. So it's nice that filters are pretty easily accessible for this particular 72mm filter size. Okay, number 5, affordability. This lens is pretty affordable because it's a kit lens. You can buy packages where the X-T4 is bundled with this lens. So what that means is you can find a lot of these things floating around on eBay for pretty reasonable prices. So if you were to purchase this, what I would recommend doing is going to eBay, looking for an auction and bidding very low. Just sort of give yourself a number, something like $400, and don't go above that, and bid on one lens, and if you don't get it, bid on another, and just keep doing that with different auctions for different versions of this lens. And you'll eventually get one for pretty cheap. That's exactly how I got this. Okay, number 6, this kind of goes along with form, but I'm talking about build quality on this one. It's a little bit different. This thing really feels premium. It's very nice. It feels stout and solid, well put together. The zoom mechanism is very stiff, so it ends up holding your zoom position really nicely, no matter the angle that you position the camera. That's not the case with the 55-200 if you've ever used that. There's a weird thing that happens when you turn the camera over. The front element actually slides out of the body of the lens because the zoom mechanism is so loose. So for on that lens, you just kind of have to get used to it and just, be mindful of how you position the lens. But that's not the case with this. You can just move this all over and it will hold your zoom position. The aperture is so tight. It's amazing how tight the aperture is. It clicks through all the way from f4 to f22. And since it's so firm, you're never going to bump it and accidentally change it to an aperture that you don't want. Comes with a big rose petal lens hood if you're into that kind of thing. Sometimes in super bright light, it's nice to have that lens hood. It's a little big for my liking, but it's nice to have for those kinds of situations. And it does that thing where it mounts upside down, which is kind of nice, while the lens cap is still on it. So if you want to carry it around, you can do that. You can just put it onto the front of the lens and sort of disengage it by turning it upside down. Just a nice, thoughtful detail. So that brings me to the last thing I want to mention. The little WR on the front of this lens means weather resistant. This lens is weather sealed. That means you can take this thing out in the rain, sleet, snow, sand blowing around. You can take it out in any kind of condition and know reliably that you're not going to get moisture or grit into the elements of the lens or onto your camera sensor. It's pretty cool. So that combined with the X-T4 makes for a very usable, durable, rugged combination. So that alone makes this thing perfect for adventures, perfect for travel, perfect for all those situations where you don't really know what to expect. Weather sealing brings that peace of mind. All right, there you go. There's 6 things that I like about this 16-80 zoom lens. For me, I can see this thing becoming pretty much an essential piece of gear, something that I'm going to always prioritize when I'm packing for trips, and something I'm probably going to carry around pretty often. However, I'm not going to completely abandon my prime lenses, but for the X-T4, this is definitely going to be my go-to lens. All right, thanks for joining me. I'll see you in the next one.